Hello, everybody. My name is Alan, and it's Tuesday, so you know what time it is. Let's talk some metal. For tonight's topic, I've got a fun one that I'm pretty excited to discuss. I'm going to talk about what was the very first American heavy metal album in the modern heavy metal era. And I will explain what I mean by that here in just a minute or two. So, you've seen videos on this channel before or watched me on some of the different live streams, like the heavy metallurgy stream that I do with Marty over on the Marty Worm channel. You know that I like a lot of this sort of early days of heavy metal material, whether it's new wave of British heavy metal or even stuff from the early 1970s. I think that stuff's really cool and interesting to check out. There's a lot of cool bands, very interesting acts. Now, I do want to say up front, though, doesn't matter what the first heavy metal album was. No, it really doesn't. And are we going to unequivocally nail it down so that there's no doubt and we can carve it in stone and know exactly what the first album was? No, we can't. At the end of the day, this is just a thought exercise for fun. It's the kind of thing that you chat about with your buddies while you're having a beer and hanging out and such. What I do want to do with the video is at least point out some of the interesting candidates for this title. So, at the end, I'm going to make my pick for what I think the first modern American metal album was. But not everyone is going to agree with me, and that's quite okay. But along the way, I'm going to point out some candidates so you can see who is in contention for that title. If you don't agree with me, you may pick one of those other albums instead, and that's quite all right. Of course, there's also going to be some things that I'll have missed and overlooked and don't know about. And so you might be able to inform me in the comments down below about some other titles that I should be checking out and see who else is in the running that hasn't even crossed my mind. Okay, so with those little disclaimers, let's get ourselves started here. Now, I'm doing it in this different format because I don't have a lot of the albums that I want to discuss. I just don't own physical copies of a lot of this stuff. So I figured this would be a better way to show some of the material that I'm talking about. So let's back up a little bit and talk, when did heavy metal begin in the first place? That's a topic for a different video, but just for some context, many people would agree that the first Black Sabbath album is the first heavy metal album. It came out on Friday the 13th, in February 1970. And yeah, a lot of folks would point to that album and say, that is your first heavy metal record. Not everybody would agree on that point. Led Zeppelin had their first album out a little over a year before that. And there were other things released prior to the first Sabbath album that could be in contention. This right away points out kind of an obvious dilemma. Do we count Led Zeppelin as heavy metal, or are they in some other category? And that comes up a lot when you're trying to identify, the first of something is what counts and what doesn't. And heavy metal is no different. In heavy metal, these two questions immediately come up and they will bog down the conversation quite a bit sometimes. You have to figure out where's going to be the dividing line between hard rock and heavy metal. I mean, heck, there are some people that don't even like using the term hard rock, period. They simply think that you have rock music and heavy metal music, and there shouldn't be this in-between hard rock category. Parallel to this question, you also have the issue of how heavy metal sounded in the 1970s compared to how it sounded in the 1980s. I've talked about 1970s heavy metal in other videos. There were lots of heavy metal bands in that decade, very early in that decade. They were called heavy metal widely at that time. But over time, some of them have gotten reclassified more as hard rock. And whether you agree with them being reclassified or not, I think everyone can agree that a lot of those bands do sound different than the heavy metal that came out a decade later, that there is a stylistic shift overall between the heavy metal of the 70s and the heavy metal of the 80s. For example, case in point, Deep Purple. Deep Purple was widely referenced as a heavy metal band for a long time in the 1970s. But if you're more of the later generation X, like myself, when you were growing up, Deep Purple was not a heavy metal band. Everybody called them a hard rock band because things shifted. The goalposts got moved. Things got categorized along the way. If you're under the age of 50, calling Deep Purple heavy metal always feels kind of wrong somehow. But if you're a little bit older, it's like, oh yeah, that was one of the heavy metal bands we listened to back in the early 70s. So yeah, this, makes these questions a bit tricky to handle. Now, of course, the things I've been discussing so far, Sabbath, Zeppelin, Purple, these aren't American bands at all. All of this is coming out of the UK scene. We're getting to the American part here. Just give me a moment. If you want to use a very wide definition of heavy metal, very, very inclusive, and say that, yes, all the 70s material, still falls under the heavy metal umbrella, in that case, I think you have a pretty clear-cut answer for what the first American heavy metal album is, and it's the one you see here, Blue Cheer's Vince Bus Eruption, which was released in 1968. For some context, this came out in January 68. That's a full calendar year before the first Led Zeppelin album, and it's 2 years and 1 month before the first Black Sabbath album. So it's not only the earliest example of a heavy metal album from the US, it's also in the contention for the first heavy metal album of all time. Again, there are some other things people would propose maybe can rival it, but I think it's hard to come up with a really good candidate for something earlier than this. This, again, though, it kind of depends on your definition of heavy metal. I've heard this album a lot. I've owned copies of this album before. For me, personally, I have a hard time calling this a heavy metal album. Yes, Blue Cheer had the volume of a heavy metal band. They had sort of the bottom end distortion, this very heavy sound. They had the heavy metal attitude. There's famous interviews of band members saying they really weren't worried about making hits or getting radio play, that they simply wanted to make loud noise as much as possible. Pure volume was their only goal. It sounds very heavy metal. But when you listen to the music, or at least when I listen to this album, I don't hear songs that fit in heavy metal very easily. What I hear is a lot of Cream and a lot of Hendrix, very blues-based rock that simply turned up louder and more distorted than Cream or Hendrix did. For goodness sake, they're covering an Eddie Cochran song from the late 50s. Nothing wrong with that. I like the Eddie Cochran song. But that's where they're coming from in terms of songwriting. You're hard-pressed to point to a song on here and say that is unequivocally a heavy metal song the way it's written. They've kind of got, the attitude and, some of the volume worked out, but they're not writing tunes that are bona fide heavy metal classics. So, yeah, it's an early relic for sure, but its place is kind of weird. Now, what I'm talking about today, though, is not just what is the first heavy metal record. I want to know what is the first modern-sounding heavy metal record from the U.S. And in terms of modern heavy metal, I'm talking, again, strip away that blues-based sound. Make it more streamlined. Make it more focused on heavy metal. And a lot of the early stuff in the 1970s, those bands had some heavy songs and some fast songs, but they also had lots of songs in very different styles. Good examples of this would be things like Mountain. Mountain could have a real heavy ass kicker like Mississippi Queen on the same album with these very dramatic soundtrack-like songs, such as Theme from an Imaginary Western. Budgie famously would have tracks like Bread Fan, which is almost proto-speed metal, on the same album with these tracks that were Beatles wannabe tracks. And so those early 70s heavy metal bands, they experimented a lot. They weren't very consistent on their albums with being heavy all the time. And at some point that changed. And for my money, the point where that really starts to change is with Judas Priest in the mid-70s. In particular with Sad Wings of Destiny, they really start to lay the groundwork for what was going to come, for what heavy metal was going to turn into. There's more focus on the twin guitar harmonies. There's more focus on making the songs a little faster, a little sharper, a little shorter maybe overall. Not having as many of the songs that are in these very different styles. Now, Priest still works some of those in here and there. You have Last Rose of Summer popping up on Sin After Sin and such. But over the course of these mid-70s albums, especially by 78, when they released 2 albums, you had Stained Class and Killing Machine. They came out just 10 months apart. And with those albums, they're really laying the foundation. The blueprint is set for what heavy metal turns into moving forward. And it sounds very different than what was happening, 6, 7 years earlier with Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and their contemporaries from the beginning of the decade. And so that's what I'm wanting to figure out here. We know that, in my mind, Judas Priest really kind of starts the modern heavy metal movement going here. But what's going to be the equivalent in American metal? What's the American version of Sad Wings of Destiny or Stained Class? The British quickly built on this template. Moving from 78 into 79, you had bands like Saxon appear on the scene. Judas Priest, continues really, taking over the world with, the fake live sounds on Unleashed in the East, where they're not only getting the heavy metal sound down, but they're getting the heavy metal style and look cemented with the chains and leather and biker gear and stuff. You've got Motorhead releasing 2 of their classic albums. It's not their first 2 albums. Motorhead, had released stuff before Overkill and Bomber came out. But those early Motorhead releases are a little jumbled up and sound a little different. Here, they really sharpen things up. And again, it's getting really hammered into this heavy metal template pretty well. But all of this, then builds right into the new wave of British heavy metal. And that's where you really get the modern 1980s style of heavy metal taking off and exploding. But what's the American equivalent? What was the album from the US that's the equivalent of something like Stained Class or Overkill? What's, that first thing that popped up on this side of the Atlantic? That's what I want to focus on for the rest of this video. Sorry it took a little while to get here with the background, but I wanted to set up the question. So when people think about, some of the classic heavy metal albums from US bands in the early 80s, things that quickly pop to mind are ones like these 3. And all of these came out in 1983. So by 1983, you've already got a lot of seminal albums being released on American shores. You've got Megaforce releasing stuff with the first Metallica album. You've got Metal Blades up and running, putting out Slayer's debut. You've got Queensryche's EP gets picked up by a major label, EMI, and is put out. So yeah, heavy metal is, kind of, thriving and exploding in America by 1983. So what I want to do is walk backwards from this point, year by year, and see how far back we can push it and find an album that might be considered a modern American heavy metal record. And another thing, just to be clear on, I'm only looking really for full-length albums here. The Queensryche EP is just an example of, there's tons of stuff from 83. But I'm not going to be looking at like singles and things like that. There are a lot of bands that put out singles in the earliest 80s that are worth taking a look at. But I want to save those for another video. I've got enough material here to talk about. I want to look at just the full-length albums for tonight's topic. So let's back up to 1982 and see what we had. Well, in 82, one of the big milestones for American metal was the release of Metal Massacre Volume 1. And this, of course, was the first compilation, launching Metal Blade Records, and giving a lot of visibility to several bands, most notably Metallica. And there were other albums in 82 as well, but something else I want to point out is that it's not always just about the albums having a big impact on the scene. Tours and things like that are also very important. A big event for American metal in 1982 was Iron Maiden touring in support of 38 Special. Now see, that seems like a weird bill to us by modern standards, but back then it made perfect sense to folks. And this was a tour where Maiden got a huge amount of exposure, and Bruce Dickinson and company was really able to conquer American shores. This is the kind of tour that had a big impact on audiences, and a lot of people went away from those shows, I'm sure, thinking, I'm going to start a heavy metal band that sounds like that. And yeah, you really see bands proliferate a lot in 83 and 84 and late 82. And I'm pretty sure this tour helped promote that and helped push American metal bands to become a lot more numerous. So yeah, it's not just about the albums. Something else I should say here is, too, it is important to remember that bands didn't just magically appear out of nowhere on the day they released their album. Black Sabbath's first album may have come out in February 1970, but they had been on the live scene, gigging and practicing and rehearsing well before that. The albums just kind of make a convenient benchmark for when there's going to be something commercially available for a wide audience to view and purchase and kind of become more aware of the band. But yeah, bands are around before these albums come out. Don't forget that. Let's see what else was out in 82. So some of the bigger contenders and smaller ones are shown here. Twisted Sister is, on the map with Under the Blade in 1982. The first release from both Virgin Steel and Manowar came out that year. You also have smaller, more unknown acts that got full albums out in 82. The Sacrifice album by Joe Stepp is a great example of this. So most folks have no problem calling these heavy metal albums. It is worth noting that compared to the stuff that was released in 83, these albums are a little bit, let's say, watered down in terms of their true metal street cred. People had no trouble calling Twisted Sister heavy metal in the early 80s, but how many people really remember them that way or think of them that way these days? Over time, Twisted Sister got thought of more as, in the glam and hair metal style. They're more adjacent to bands like Wasp than they are Iron Maiden or Judas Priest. That first Virgin Steel album, Virgin Steel's had a long career and released a lot of great heavy metal records. But this debut album has a very odd sound to it. If you've never heard that particular Virgin Steel album, it's a weird one. By the time their second album came out, Guardians of the Flame, it was much more metallic than this debut. This debut has a lot of just sort of basic rock and roll elements about it. I like early Virgin Steel a lot, but this first album, it's hard to love. It's not their best songwriting. It's a band still finding their footing and trying to find a style even. In fact, if you took the name Virgin Steel off that album and you just, said it was done by Ball and Chain and put some other name on it, I don't know how much attention it would get from heavy metal fans. You can make some of the same claims about that debut Manowar album. Battle Hymns is a kooky kind of album. Now, I like Battle Hymns. I want to make that real clear. I'm not trashing the album. It's a fun listen, but it's a cheesy album. It's not talking about, swords and hail and kill and kings of metal. It's more like, riding around and, flipping the birds, any squares who look at me funny and stuff. It's really cheesy in a lot of ways. But it's a fun listen. But compared to Into Glory Ride, yeah, it's very, very different. You don't have, all these big Orson Welles voiceovers making it, Conan the Barbarian dramatic and epic. It's a real goofy, loose sounding album compared to that. And so even here in 82, yeah, you can call these heavy metal records. No one's going to yell at you too much for that. But it's getting a little tamer compared to what was happening just a year later with Show No Mercy and Kill 'Em All. And there's nothing like that in the 1982 roster that I came across. All right, well, let's push it back to 81. 81, you got lots of contenders. There's American metal albums out there. The first Kirith Ungol album's a personal favorite. I love Frost and Fire. But it does still have one foot firmly planted in the 70s. There's no denying that. Again, when Kirith Ungol would come out with their second album, it had moved forward in terms of its heaviness quite a bit. Frost and Fire is a great album, but is it a modern? Would you want to really call it the first unabashedly modern American album? Some people might say that it's just a little too 70s leaning. I get why there's some debate there. Crisis Hard as Rock is an album that has a cult underground following. It is not a personal favorite, but it operates in the vein that a lot of these bands were in the earliest 80s. It owes a lot, I think, to the one shown there next to it, Riot. Fire Down Under has some classic anthem songs on it, Swords and Tequila and Fire Down Under and such. At the same time, though, there are a lot of folks that don't consider early Riot to be especially heavy. Again, some people kind of think of them, they're in that rock metal in-between gray zone a little bit. I've got no problem calling Fire Down Under a heavy metal album. Some people might disagree. Hey, that's cool. You got the first Motley Crue album. We called it heavy metal at the time. Motley Crue, of course, changed their sound and style pretty rapidly so that it became, again, a band that serious heavy metal fans wanted nothing to do with. Later, even as early as Theater of Pain, a lot of folks were checking out on that band. But that first album, yeah, people consider it heavy metal, and it's still loved by a lot of heavy metal fans. You've got, again, albums that are a little more obscure, like Mistreaters, Hellfire. They were a Cleveland area band. You also have an important compilation album with US Metal Volume 1. So this one came out a good year earlier than Metal Massacre Volume 1 did. This was on Shrapnel, of course. And, while it showcases some heavy metal stuff, again, it's one that showcases a lot of just like solo artists who are meant to be like guitar whiz kids. It's kind of, looking for, the Yngwie Malmsteen of America in a way. So, we've got some, legit heavy metal stuff here, but it is worth noting again that it's not, as aggressive as what you would see in the 1983 roster. But I think we can still call these heavy metal and feel good about ourselves and sleep easy at night. So let's push it back another year, see what we've got from 1980. I think 80 is where it gets really interesting, and your pickings start to get pretty fuzzy. Some examples here. The White Boy and the Average Rat Band album. It's a personal favorite. I admit there's a little bias there, but I'll be fair. I don't think you can call that a heavy metal album. It's got a big outsider rock influence. Some of the songs definitely have heavy elements to them. It's got, this fuzzy guitar tone and stuff. It appeals to heavy metal fans. I like it a lot. But would you say, yeah, it's definitely a heavy metal album in the modern sense? The Stained Class and Killing Machine and Sad Wings of Destiny sense? Probably not. That's probably not where it belongs. The Full Moon album, State of the Artist, is kind of similar. On one hand, you can listen to parts of that album and say that, yeah, these are guys, really getting that heavy metal crunch added into their sound. But you can also listen to it and hear a lot of Thin Lizzy. Like, yeah, these dudes are kind of just rocking out Jailbreak style. There's nothing wrong with that. Thin Lizzy's a great band. But they would be a very good example of more the 70s style of heavy metal, which, again, a lot of people would just refer to as hard rock and leave it at that in the first place. So Full Moon probably falls more on that hard rock 70s metal side of things. There's hints of 80s metal there, but I don't think there's enough to call it the modern American album. It's a cool album. It doesn't get enough attention. I think it's one that deserves more focus from people. Now, one that a lot of people would point to and say, aha, here you go. Here's your bona fide heavy metal modern classic in America from 1980, Manila Road's Invasion. There's a couple of issues here. Now, again, I love a lot of Manila Road, and especially early Manila Road. But first off, I'm cheating a little bit because this is a mini LP, I guess. 6 songs, 30-ish minutes. I always disliked that mini LP designation where it's longer than an EP, but you still don't call it an album. For the sake of argument, let's consider it an album. Invasion sounds really different than most of the other material in Manila Road's catalog. Some of the stuff on the Dreams of Eschaton demo they did after this kind of fit with the Invasion sound, but after that point, they really abandoned that style. By the time you get to their first full-length album, Metal, they've changed their style quite a bit. It's much heavier and more focused on, sounding more metal. Invasion has some fast songs on it, Street Jammer and stuff. It has some cool, longer, epic songs like The Empire. It also has some real throwaway tracks on it. Let's just be honest, that one about, the cat and the dog having the mange. Man, that's a bad song. This album owes a lot to their 70s influences. One of my hot takes for this video is that if you took the name Manila Road off that album and you just put some other random band name on there, Hot Flash released Invasion. And it sounded just like this album. It's this exact same album, but, the band was called Flash and they never released anything else. I don't know how many heavy metal fans would care about this release very much. And I sure don't think a lot of people would point towards it saying, yeah, this is bona fide modern American metal. I think that'd be a tough hill to try to die on, and I ain't going there. The one on this slide for me that I think is really worth a strong look is the debut album from the Rods, Rock Hard. Now, this was originally a self-financed, self-released album. They got picked up by Arista within a year, and the album got reissued on Arista just with the name The Rods. And there were a couple of songs swapped out for the album, but 7 out of 10 tracks are the same, something like that. So it's essentially the same album, but it did originally get pressed in 1980. And for my money, it's safe to call this a modern sounding heavy metal album. They've got the power trio format. It's got the hot guitar work from Dave Feinstein. I have no problem referring to the early Rods as modern American metal. So I think we can push our modern American starting point at least back here to 1980 still. I think we still do have a good contender before 1981. So we're okay in 1980. Let's see if we can push it back into the 70s. Again, the UK already had lots of bands and lots of albums doing stuff by 79. What was happening in the US? This is where it gets real tough to find something. Some things that popped up while I was doing research for this are shown here. You have Whitesnake in 79. And I'm sorry, but I don't know if at any point in time Whitesnake was ever really considered a heavy metal band. Nothing against Whitesnake. They've got some good songs and stuff. But did anybody ever call Whitesnake heavy metal? I'm not sure. I'm not going there. Same is kind of true with Sammy Hagar. I have nothing against Sammy Hagar, but I've never had any real interest in his music before Van Halen or with Van Halen or after Van Halen. So, again, in my mind, Sammy Hagar is the perfect example of just a rock dude. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, he's a radio-friendly rock dude who, can play up the party image and be, kind of heavy-ish, but in a very digestible for a commercial market kind of manner. I mean, come on, the man's wearing a white leisure suit on the cover of this album. In the same year, you've got Rob Halford rocking, the chains and leather look. No, I'm sorry, this is not a heavy metal release. The first TKO album. Now, this is interesting because TKO did release some bona fide heavy stuff in the 1980s. Their debut from 79, though, I've listened to it, and it's not a heavy metal album, in my opinion. It is a very much just a 70s rock sounding album. I don't hear heavy metal when I play that album. I like some of their later stuff. Not a huge fan of this first one, though. I mean, the very fact that you've got some kind of weird looking claymation rock'em sock'em robots on the cover is just like, I don't know what's going on there, and I don't really want to know either. I don't think we can call that modern American metal. The one shown here that would probably generate the most debate is the Legend album, From the Fjords. If you look this one up on YouTube to see what it sounds like, one of the very first comments at the top of the page is somebody just gushing over the album, calling it a classic American heavy metal epic masterpiece of an album. And lots of comments agree with it. This is going to be my other hot take for this video. I do not think this is a heavy metal album, and I don't even think it's a particularly good rock album. And I'm not saying that to be a jerk. If you like the album, that's great. It's cool. No problem. You can enjoy it. I am not here to yuck your yum. But I just don't think this has any hints about it that say this is America's equivalent of Stained Class or Hellbent for Leather. It's just not there. It looks really promising. I know. I've owned the album. I've listened to it a lot. It's got a cool name. It's got a cool logo. The title's got the word fjords in it, which makes you think of Vikings. And there are few things that are any more heavy metal than Vikings. The artwork is there, but the music is very laid back 70s hard rock sounding. There's some good musicians in the band. I'm not knocking them for that stuff, but the songs do not have any heavy metal bite to them. the vocalist. I'm not saying he's a bad vocalist, but he's got a very laid back, kind of almost, wistful delivery. There's no power there. There's no punch. There's no crunch. There's no bite. It's missing the elements that make it heavy metal in the modern new wave of British heavy metal, sense. It's just not there on that album for me. The low point on that album, just for context, there's the drum solo track in the middle goes on way too long. It's called The Iron Horse, and at one point it has the band basically emulating the sound of a choo-choo train, complete with a little steam whistle going choo-choo, while the drummer's sitting there going choo-choo. There's the whistle again. What the hell? That is not metal. No, you don't do that. Look, I get cheesy can be fun sometimes. I said a few minutes ago, I'm quite okay with the cheesy fun of Manowar's battle hymns, but Iron Horse making choo-choo sounds in the middle of what's supposed to be some kind of epic metal American masterpiece? No. Personal foul, throw the red card, whatever reference I need to get in there, you're disqualified. You don't do that. There's a fine line between clever and cheesy and stupid and all that. That ends up on the wrong side of that. So yeah, sorry. If you like From the Fjords, that's cool. I don't care for the album, and I don't hear anything on that album that would make me say that, yes, this is modern American metal. To me, it's tired 70s rock music. So yeah, I don't have a good contender in 79. I want to push it back a little bit further, though, and see what we come up with. Because in 1978, there are two really interesting contenders. They're by a band called Sorcery, but wait for it, it's not the same band. You had two different bands from America, both calling themselves Sorcery, release albums in 1978 that are kind of heavy metal-ish, but they're not connected to each other. All right. This one over here, under the number 1978 on your screen, this is the debut album from the Chicago area band called Sorcery, and the album's titled Sinister Soldiers. And once again, kind of like the Legend album, this album looks promising. It's got kind of, the right band name. Sinister Soldiers is kind of a cool album title. It's hinting it could be metal. You've got, hooded figures and big crosses and, dark riders on the cover. It looks like it's got potential. You want to check this out. And there are some heavier songs on the album that do have some metallic bite. There's some crunch here. At times you can hear, the beginnings of something pretty heavy. I hesitate to call this a flat-out modern American heavy metal record, though, because, while there are some cool heavy tunes on it, there are also some pretty weak non-metal tunes on it. Yeah, there are some long, drawn-out, slow, sappy-sounding tracks. Again, this album fits into that sort of budgie tradition from the early 70s of having songs in very, very different styles throughout the album. It is not a consistently heavy record from start to finish, and I think that is something you're looking for when you're trying to pin down what counts as a modern heavy metal album. That when you listen to those new wave of British heavy metal records and stuff, they weren't dicking around putting some kind of commercial friendly tune in the middle of it, and they weren't dicking around with soft ballady commercial friendly songs, or they weren't experimenting with a psychedelic number or anything. They were making the metal very consistent throughout the album, and Sinister Soldiers doesn't deliver that. So I would not stake a claim to that one. It's an interesting listen, and it's noteworthy, but for my money, it's not quite there. Now, what about this other Sorcery? The one over here with the really crazy looking album cover, this was an LA band, so right on the West Coast. And this band has a weird backstory. Apparently they were pretty hot stuff on the live scene. They had a pretty big live show that included professional magicians dressing up as like Merlin and the devil and doing like these magical tricks as part of a magical duel, kind of, having this big theatrical element to the stage show. Sounds like it could have been cool. I don't know. Maybe it was corny as all get out. But yeah, they were, as you can see on the title here, they were on the soundtrack for this particular motion picture project. Band members were involved in another motion picture a few years later. This band was on a couple of the old like Dick Clark TV specials for like a Halloween special one year and stuff. So they had some recognition. They must have had some good connections because they got plugged in sometimes. But we're not too worried about that here. Is the album heavy metal in a modern sense or not? Well, it's kind of like the other Sorcery album. There are moments on here that are pretty heavy. There are some songs they're playing with some occult themes in the lyrics, and they're getting a little over the top and getting a little bit of a heavier, rumblier sound at times. So there are some moments you can point to and be like, yeah, that very much sounds like a dawn of modern metal. The problem with the Stunt Rock album is there's also a whole lot of material on it that sounds more like early 70s Deep Purple, which isn't a bad thing. Deep Purple did some great stuff. But, you get these tracks that are very clearly influenced, by, the Hammond organ sounds of, Pace and, all those guys, John Lord. It's just like, well, again, it's not consistent enough for my money to call it a flat out modern heavy metal album. In the broader sense of, heavy metal in the 70s and such, yeah, I think you could throw this in there and say this is, a cool 70s metal relic from the US. No problem with calling it that. But, is it the United States version of Stained Class? No, I don't think it's the benchmark I'm looking for here. So yeah, 79 and 78, I haven't come across anything. I want to push back one more year, though, because there was one thing in 77 that deserves a mention, and it's this thing. The debut album from Riot, Rock City. Now, I want to say up front, I'm a little biased on this one because it's one of my favorite Riot albums. It's definitely my favorite album of the Guy Speranza era of Riot. This album has some material on it that undoubtedly could pass as modern heavy metal. In particular, the song Warrior. They still play it live, and it still sounds like it'd be a song that would be written today. It's right there alongside tracks like Judas Priest's Exciter or Deep Purple's Fireball. It's, one of these fast songs up there with Highway Star. Yeah, it fits the bill just fine. Does Rock City have enough consistent bangers like that, though? If I'm being honest and I'm being fair, I don't know. It definitely will stand side by side with any of the great hard rock albums from the late 70s. The Thin Lizzies and Scorpions and UFOs of the world. Riot can be right there toe-to-toe with any of them. Love Rock City. Amazing album. As much as I would love to say that, yeah, this is, the dawn of heavy metal in America in the modern age, I don't know. You've got a tough case to make. While there's great songs throughout this album, a lot of them probably are still a little too much in that late 70s hard rock template to pass off as modern heavy metal. Excellent album. Love it to death. Riot were undoubtedly a big influence on a lot of the American metal bands that did pop up at the end of the 70s and started releasing things in the earliest 80s. No doubt they were a big factor there. But, Rock City as a modern American staple, I want to say yes, but it's a tough sell. Before that, I don't think you've got anything. So I haven't found anything from 76 or earlier that I would say is an example of modern heavy metal in America. And that makes sense because in 76, you're already getting back to when Sad Wings of Destiny came out. And so you'd really be digging in the weeds for something. So what's the verdict? Well, if I'm going to make a pick, I'm going to put my money on that first Rods album from 1980 and say, there's your first modern American heavy metal album. But again, I'm not trying to say this is, the end of the story and all must agree with me or they're wrong and stupid and I hate you. No. Just for my money, this is where modern American metal began. Other folks are going to disagree, and that's quite okay. So this is where I shut up and you yell at me in the comments down below and tell me What did I miss? Which albums did I overlook? Because I know I've overlooked stuff. There are things I have forgotten or things I have never heard of and just didn't come across. I did try to do a lot of digging for this video, looking through things, Google searches, Discogs, metal archives, going through my own collection. So I pulled, stuff as best I could, but hey, I missed things for sure. So leave a comment down below and tell me which album needs to be considered as a contender that wasn't talked about here. Which album am I seriously underselling? Maybe one of those things from 78 or 79 I need to go back and give a much closer listen to, and then I can push that marker back a couple of years past the Rod's debut. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. All right, but that is going to do it for this one. So until next time, everybody stay safe, and as always, keep banging your head while trying to figure out when we all started banging our head to modern albums.